To discuss these developments, I'm now joined by immigration specialist Munyaradzi Nkomo. Munyaradzi, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. Now, how does the extension of the Zimbabwe Exemption Permit expiration impact individuals who currently hold the permit?
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you for having me. Well, I think it does help in that it allows people who haven't taken the opportunity to apply for the mainstream visa applications to do so in a manner that is not under pressure, because I think, as the Minister said, in the recent days there has been an increase in the number of people taking up the call to apply. And the sense was that the time that was left in June was not sufficient to allow VFS to receive these applications on time. So I think the extension will allow people to make those submissions and possibly get outcomes which will allow them to continue to stay in the country for those who want to stay in the country.
Now, you speak of getting possible outcomes that will allow some of those holders to stay in the country. But one of the biggest talking points has been the thought process around you make an application, but it's very, very unlikely that you will succeed in getting an extension of some sort. What is the situation around that?
You know, Hugo, I think that situation has got a historical context to it. When this announcement was made in 2021, there were a series of applications that were submitted across the board, from your highly skilled individuals to your low skilled individuals. And at the beginning of 2022, a flurry of rejections were received, which seems to suggest that or reinforce the idea that this was just a process towards a mass removal. But to the credit of the Minister, he did subsequently reverse those decisions, and a lot of people received notifications that those decisions were going to be reversed. And there was a period of silence which was dominated by the court case. And subsequent to that, as we got to the end of 2022 into 2023, we started to see a fresh batch of decisions coming out, which, to my knowledge, most of them, if not all of them, have been positive. So I think the initial apprehension comes from the initial outcomes, but what we are seeing from the applications that have been submitted and have been processed, and I'm talking about your individuals who are not critical skills, because those individuals have always received their visas from the get-go. We're mainly talking about people who aren't critical skills applying for the general work visa via the waiver process, which was alluded to in the earlier interview. Those outcomes have been positive. We've seen quite a number of them being positive. So I think in this context now, the apprehension is misplaced, and people should just go and apply. Now,
you raise an issue around the waiver, and also you bring in critical skills into the equation. Now, the issue with critical skills, and generally most of those that have been granted permits to reside or to work in South Africa, has been based on their qualifications. Now, what we understand is that the majority of these 180,000 Zimbabwe Exemption Permit holders are not qualified or do not have critical skills. Some of these are Uber drivers, some of these are domestic workers, and so on. So where does a waiver come in, and what does a waiver actually mean?
So the waiver is a ministerial power whereby a person can approach the minister to request an exemption from having to comply with one or more requirements of any visa. It's arguable that the ZEP itself is an exemption of sorts, because it's issued under the same section that the exemptions clause exists, section 31(2) of the Immigration Act, specifically subsection C, whereby the minister can waive any prescribed requirement to a foreigner or category of foreigners. Now, this would be in lieu of a general work visa or even a business visa in some instances, whereby you are saying to the minister, please exempt me from having to comply with this requirement in a general work visa application. Once that application is processed and you're granted a waiver, you then go apply for the visa and comply with the other requirements except that one requirement, or the requirements that you've been exempted from having to comply by the minister. So that is what a waiver is in essence. And look, from what we've seen, the department has been generous. I have to be honest about that. They have been generous. I've seen a domestic helper with an approved waiver. And it's not the first time that the department has granted a waiver, even though in some circumstances they have had to be taken to court to get waivers for domestic helpers in certain special circumstances. But each circumstance has to come and be motivated based on individual circumstances. So to make statements that the majority don't have qualifications and they're not eligible for that visa, I think these are statements that aren't necessarily true. I think when you do an analysis of the people who are actually applying... So
the situation has changed, basically?
It has changed significantly. I have to say, where we were this time last year, and where we are this year, it's very different. Even the messaging from the department is completely different from what they were saying at the beginning, and where we are today, it's a very different, it's more positive than when it was at the beginning.
So obviously a welcome relief for many of those Zimbabweans that are on the Zimbabwe exemption permits. Now let's talk about those that aren't on the Zimbabwe exemption permit. Is there an avenue, is there a way for those that are here looking to legalize their estate to put in an application at this juncture?
Yeah, certainly there are avenues that are there. I think there are several visa options that people can explore. Whether you are a critical skills work individual or general work visa, there are other artist visas. So I think there are several categories that under the Immigration Act, and I find our laws are quite expansive and accommodating. There are challenges with the processes, but I think it's not unique to South Africa, and there are mechanisms in place, very robust mechanisms in place to deal with any challenges that arise in any visa process. Yeah.
Now, from the media reports, we've been picking up that 10,000 individuals had gone to the Zimbabwe embassy to seek for assistance to travel back to Zimbabwe. Do you suspect that many of those will change their minds or reverse those decisions? Because now, all of a sudden, there's an extra 6 months that's available for people to put in their applications.
Well, I think certainly people who would have lost hope at the beginning, who would have approached the embassy to say, help us to go back home, would probably want to try their chances and see if they'll get any opportunity or are successful in their applications, especially given the apparent change in the department's approach. And I think that's why you've seen a huge influx of people applying. That coupled with the delay in the court applications decision, or the court's decision in the challenge, whereby a lot of people had put their hopes on the courts to intervene, and there's been silence. So that coupled with the positive outcomes that they would have heard about from their friends and relatives, that probably would result in those who had lost hope in trying to apply.
Munya, my final question. Normally, if you've stayed in South Africa, I'd like to believe for a period of 10 years or upwards of 5 years, you're eligible to apply for a permanent residency. Do we expect that this application, following this waiver, will now grant these individuals permanent residency, or is it a general work permit? What are they applying for?
So I think there's a misunderstanding around the immigration rules and the pathway to permanent residence. It's not just the passage of time that leads to a right to apply for permanent residence, but it's the passage of time on a specific status that gives rise to a right to permanent residence. So you could be here on a study visa for 20 years. You will not get the right to apply for permanent residence on that basis. So there are certain visas that have pathways to permanent residence, and that has always been the problem with the ZEP, that they expressly prohibited people from applying for permanent residence. You could be a spouse to a citizen or permanent resident for over 5 years. Ordinarily, you would qualify for permanent residence, but because you're on a ZEP, it did not allow you to do so. Same with people with critical skills who are on a ZEP or working for several years. So moving to the general work visa, the pathway to permanent residence opens up after 5 years of continuous employment and permanent employment. If you have critical skills, if you move from the ZEP to critical skills and you've got the appropriate post-qualification experience, you qualify for permanent residence. So I think a lot of people talk about, I've been in South Africa for 5 years, 10 years, I should have permanent residence. But the rules don't actually say that. It's the passage of time on a specific status.
Munyaradzi Nkomo, I appreciate your time on Africa Today. Munyaradzi Nkomo is an immigration specialist and speaking to us about Zimbabwe's exemption permits, which have been extended by a further 6 months.